Greetings! I'm Hal Ming with the Center for Food Preservation Arts, and welcome to the 4th episode of our home food preservation series we're doing in collaboration with Food is Free Tacoma and their Food Independence Gardens program. Now, people say that making jams and jellies is the gateway drug to canning because it is so easy compared to some other techniques, and you can learn all about water bath canning and preparing fruit and making recipes safely. Today we're going to be doing a recipe that uses rhubarb and strawberries, both products that are easily available here in the Pacific Northwest, and both of them freeze very well. So even if they're coming into season at different times, you can freeze one of them and use it later with the other one, or freeze both and use them all during the winter. So there are many different kinds of preserves, and we have a list here of the different kinds. And it goes all the way from jellies, which are basically just the juice that has been made into a nice gel, all the way down to things like chutneys and compotes, which are barely cooked pieces of fruit suspended in that gel. And it's that gel which helps make those kind of preserves shelf stable, because all bacteria need available water to be able to grow and reproduce. And the pectin that we use to make those gels binds that water together, as well as the acidity of the fruit, and then also the fact that we cook the fruits and water bath can them. So all of those things work together to preserve the fruit and make it shelf stable. A little bit more about pectin. There are a couple of different kinds of pectin. There's a high methoxyl pectin, which is the kind that is usually found in traditional pectins. And then there is also a low methoxyl. And the high methoxyl, all pectins need an activator. And the high form, which is made usually from apple peels, requires a lot of sugar as an activator. It can be as much as almost 2 times as much sugar to fruit. Whereas the low version of it is made usually from citrus peels. And one of the more common ones, and the ones that we like to use a lot, is the Pomona's Universal Pectin. And so that doesn't really require any sweetener at all if you don't wish, because it's activated with a calcium salt. And it's a very small quantity of it, but it really works wonders. And as I said, you can make it with artificial sweeteners if you wish, or with just the natural sweetness of the fruit. So when you buy the pectin, it usually comes in these little packages. You can, if you discover that you really like it, you can order it in up to 1 pound. When you get the package, it comes with 3 different components in it. So there's a package that is the pectin powder, and this is what the powder looks like. There's also a package that has the calcium salts in it. That's what that looks like. And then the third is a sheet of instructions, which are not really recipes, but it's a way of converting almost any recipe that uses fruit to use Pomona's pectin, and so allowing you to reduce the sugar and control some of the other ingredients in it. Now, they also have a website which has a lot of recipes on it, including a really nice one that we're doing tonight, the rhubarb strawberry jam. So there are 2 steps that you usually do before you actually start cooking the jam or jelly that you're making. The first of which would be to make up the calcium water. And basically, it's taking a ½ teaspoon of the calcium powder and mixing it with a ½ cup of water. Now, I like to put it into these squeeze bottles. They recommend that besides whatever container you're going to store it in, that you make sure it's very clean, but they also recommend you keep it in the fridge just in case there are any bacteria. The second prep that you're going to do in advance is if you've ever used like cornstarch, pectin is very similar in some ways to cornstarch in the way that it binds up water. And so if you just throw the pectin directly into the jam or jellies, it will tend to make clumps and not dissolve. So what you always want to do is take the sweetener and you mix the pectin with it ahead of time. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of pros besides the control that you have over the jam and jelly. And another one that you have is with traditional pectins, they tend to be a little bit fragile, that you need to follow the proportions in the recipe exactly. With Pomona's pectin, it is very, very flexible. And you're able to just by using a little mathematics, reduce or increase the recipe. You can make it as much as 3 times, but if you're making a triple batch, you need to be sure that it's not so big that you can't thoroughly stir it. So we're mixing the pectin and the sweetener together. If you were using if you were using honey instead of sugar, it's the same thing, but you want to make sure the honey is warm. If you don't want to use any sweetener of any kind, there are some steps for warming up some water and just mixing it with that really, really well ahead of time. So we have that all ready, and we're going to go ahead. This is some rhubarb, and you start off by cooking the rhubarb down, just cutting it up. I had some rhubarb that I had frozen when it first came on this season, so that's what I used. And then strawberries, and you puree them, or I like to mash them up with a hand masher, just because if you puree, you tend to incorporate a lot of extra oxygen, air in general into it. And if you've ever worked with strawberry jams, that is one fruit that really has a tendency of getting what you call fruit float, where it separates a little bit and you get the fruit floating up above the rest of the liquid. No big deal. You can just take and stir it back together. But that has a lot to do with how much oxygen and air has been entrapped in the purees or the mash that you make. So we've put together the 2 fruits. And then what we're going to do is add the calcium water to this and make sure it's well mixed up. And this is a half batch. Usually you'd use 2 cups of each kind of fruit. Most of the recipes are based on it being, ending up to be about 4 to 5 jars, jam jars, and then some lemon juice. And we go ahead and begin to heat that up, and we want to bring that to a full boil. And you notice we haven't added this yet. As soon as we add that, it starts setting up. So we want to make sure we have all the cooking done and everything is ready for it. And while that is going ahead and cooking, going to go ahead and get out the jars. And on our website, there are some articles that I have been collecting. And one of them includes the fact that now They're trying to make people aware of the fact that you no longer have to sterilize the jars or the lids as long as they're well washed and as long as the processing time is a minimum of 10 minutes. Because they've found over time, all the studies they've done, that the bacterial load is reduced just by the heating. They do still recommend that you warm the jars so that when you put the hot product into it, there's less chance of there being a thermal shock and having it break. So we have the jars ready, and this is starting to boil. I might crank it up just a little bit. Now, especially if you're doing a recipe where you're not using any added pectin, you want to be aware of a couple of tests you can see to make sure that it's ready to set up or that it is setting up. With this, after we've added the mixture of the sugar and the pectin, we'll do some of those tests. But the couple of them tests that are real simple are a sheeting test, where you can already see it's sort of happening just from the natural pectin that's in here, is that some of it starts to sheet and stick to the spoon. The other is just a variation of that. That's the plate test. Now, it would be best if these had come out of the freezer, just because it will speed it up, but any plate will do, even if it's room temperature. All right, now that this has had an opportunity to thoroughly cook, we stir in the sugar and the pectin. And you can already, when you stir it, you can start to feel the way it's beginning to thicken up. You can see there's a lot more sheeting to it. And if this plate was not at room temperature, if it was a little cooler, it would be sticking very thoroughly, but you can see that it's already forming a nice mass. And so that's the plate test. And so we'll go ahead and turn this back on, let it start heating up. And you want to get your paper towel with some little bit of water on it. And so all recipes have a headroom. And in this case, the headroom is going to be about 1/4 inch. So that's about that, or maybe even a touch more. Good. And so the original recipe makes between 4 and 5 jars, and we're going to end up with 2.5. And so what I like to do is call the half one an orphan jar, which you can take home, put in the refrigerator, and eat it within the next day or two. You don't want to try and water bath can a partial jar like this. It might seal. I've never tried it, but even if it does, you can't be sure that it has forced all the air out. And that's one of the problems if you don't pay attention to the headroom. All the recipes have been geared to the amount of time it would take to not only heat it thoroughly all the way to the center of the product so that it's completely safe, but also, there they are. For a moment I misplaced my rings. But it's the amount of time that it will take to get all the air out. And I say all the air, I mean, quite honestly, it isn't complete vacuum. It isn't like space or anything, but it's enough of it that it will suck. So you can hear this doesn't have the seal. Once that it's been thoroughly cooled after we water bath can it, then it's going to have a completely different sound. And we may even be able to hear that tonight. And so we're going to bring that back up to a full boil. So I should point out that in the filming, we probably lost sight of the fact that the contents that were going in here would be very hot. Now, since we're not actually having to boil the jars before we put the contents in, they will cool a little bit faster, but you still want to use a lot of care when you pick them up. So you can just use a cloth, you can use a piece of paper towel, you can fill them, and then put the rings on just finger tight. So while this is finishing cooking, wanted to talk a little bit about mold. People all the time are saying that, well, because it's all gelled up and sealed and everything, after I open it, if it gets a little mold on it, I just scrape the mold off. Well, that's what we all used to do. I mean, really. But the problem is, and they've discovered it now, that far more people have sensitivities to mold, and they're recognizing it, that mold are kind of like mushrooms. When they grow, they set down roots all the way through the entire product, and any part of it could be toxic. So if you find in an open, well, if it's an unopened jar, immediately throw it out if it's got mold on it, because that means it didn't get properly cooked and sealed. But after it's opened, if you develop some mold on it, I'm afraid you really should just trash the whole contents, because it's a little bit too dangerous. And so remember that while the jars are not going to be as hot as the older process was, you still need to use caution holding them when you fill them. And so this then will continue to come to a full rolling boil for about 10 minutes, and then we can take them out. And so now this boiled at a full rolling boil for 10 minutes, which is when you start the timer. And after the time is up, you turn the heat off and let it sit with the lid on for 5 minutes, which allows the lid to be sucked down as the vacuum begins. And then we can go ahead and take them out of the canner. Now, because they're still very hot, they're going to be liquid, but we know from our tests that they will be setting up. And you want to always be sure not to tip the jars when you bring them out. And our first instinct is to try and blot and get all that water off of there. Well, you don't want to push on the lids, and you don't want to turn the rings at all. So if you really want to be sure, you just drop the cloth over the top of it and let it absorb. And so that's basically a lot of information about how pectin works Pomona's pectin in particular, and making jams and jellies. And as always, we have a resource list, and the link to that resource list will be in the description of the video, or if you're finding this on YouTube, it'll be, or not on YouTube, if you're finding it on Facebook, there will be in the comments a link. So thank you for joining us for the 4th episode, and we'll see you next time.